You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Well, hello everyone. I'm Chris, and I'll make a semi-wild guess and assume that there are two types of listeners for this episode. Those who pay attention to the global box office and know exactly what this episode is about, and those who may not be aware that Chinese films have started to compete with Hollywood when it comes to just racking in the big bucks. Every year, we are seeing Chinese blockbusters make a killing, and many are among the extended list of top-grossing films of all time, including 3 in the all-time top 100. Has China taken Hollywood to task? How do these films actually compare to their American equivalents? Do they have something American blockbusters do not have, or are they just cheap imitations? Oh, and should film fans be paying more attention to China and Chinese blockbusters? Because so far, Western audiences just don't seem to, despite the fact that these films are usually readily available on Netflix, Amazon Prime, and other streaming services. To answer these questions, Mathieu Sol and I have picked out 4 completely different Chinese blockbusters, starting with The Wandering Earth, a huge sci-fi action spectacle, before we then continue to the Detective Chinatown franchise, a buddy almost cop comedy because those still do well in China. And then we'll move on to Pegasus for the quote-unquote inspirational sports drama, another type of film that is seemingly alive and well, before we finally finish off with the biggest animated blockbuster so far in China's history, Ne Sha. We are going to dive into the special effects, the production values, the acting and the character development, the storytelling, and everything else to see just how swept away and or unimpressed we are with these 4 films. So, let's get Mathieu and Sol into the conversation here, and also set the stage a little bit by asking the titular question of this episode. What's the deal with these Chinese blockbusters? Are they good, bad, mediocre, better than Hollywood? Oh, and we can probably get this temperature check started in alphabetical order. So, Mathieu, take it away. What's the deal with these Chinese blockbusters?
Well, I guess the deal is they're kind of trying to do their own version of Hollywood, like others have done before and are still doing. As for the general question of are they better or worse at it, I have seen only a very small sample, so from my experience, I would say a bit worse, but I'm still very curious about them anyway.
So I think the deal with these Chinese blockbusters is that in China there is quite a bit of censorship. So in terms of what's approved for release, there isn't a whole lot of films. So a lot of these films, I think, rack up the big box office numbers because there simply isn't anything better showing if you want to go out and see something. But in terms of the quality of it, like Mature said, they're trying to do the same thing as Hollywood and create their own Hollywood films. And I don't think they're any better or any worse at other countries when it comes to doing that. A lot of countries have tried doing their own Hollywood films, and I don't think the ones from China are particularly better or worse, but, they are interesting.
Is the limit on the number of films released that you mentioned, Saul, is that only for foreign films? Because that's what I thought. I guess there was also censorship for Chinese films, of course, but I don't know if there's the same limit. Do you know?
No, I don't know. All I know is from what I've read, from what other people have said on Letterboxd and other sites where they've talked about the films. And I do know that the limited availability of what's out there is one of the contributors to why they do so well successfully at the box office in China.
Okay.
No, that's a really interesting take for sure, and thank you for adding that in, Sol. I mean, I haven't seen a whole lot of Chinese blockbusters, especially from the last year, but I will say that from what I have seen, the effects add up. They clearly have the budgets to deliver films on the same scope as Hollywood or close. So there's very little to be desired there. And in terms of the general quality, I mean, for this episode, we've gone through a fairly small sample, like I mentioned previously. So I'm not sure how representative that is. But if you just take this small sample and compare it to a small sample of Hollywood, I don't think the quality is that far off. I haven't seen a recent Chinese blockbuster that I would say is great in the same way that some American blockbusters actually manage to be. But yeah, I would say that overall I'm very impressed by what China has actually been managing to turn out.
Yeah, in terms of the effects, that's definitely true. They definitely are on par with Hollywood on that part. And I would say I'm like you. I have a very, actually, all of the films we are going to talk about in this episode are the sum total of recent Chinese blockbusters that I've seen. So yeah, very limited experience. But I remember when I saw, well, one of them a few years ago, I was thinking, oh yeah, that's great. I hope there's better. And I like you, Chris, I don't think I've seen yet a very good Chinese blockbuster. I mean, it's probably out there, but I haven't encountered it yet, I guess.
Okay, I don't know if I've seen a very good Chinese blockbuster either. I have seen more than Mature has. A lot of them are films that I watched during the May challenge on the ICM forum, which was for Hong Kong and Chinese and Taiwanese films. So I saw quite a few then, but there were even ones that I'd seen before then. I've probably seen around 10 in total, maybe 12. None of them really stand out as particularly amazing, but most of them for me have at least been fairly enjoyable. Like we've already said, they're pretty good on the special effects. They've got the budget to be able to create these things. And I guess in that sort of respect, they're doing a bit better than maybe Nigeria and Nollywood is doing.
Have you seen many Nollywood films? I mean, that's a bit of a tangent, but I always hear about Nollywood, but I've never seen one of their films. So have you?
I've seen, I'm not sure how many I've had. I've seen maybe 4 or 5. So I guess not a big enough sample to like quantify and say Nollywood not good at all or anything. The only one which I thought was really good is there was an interesting bit of a thriller one called The CEO, which is about these people applying for this CEO job. But yeah, the rest of them, which I saw, didn't really do much for me. Very, sentimental, very over the top acting, or at least the small sample I've seen.
Yeah, I've only seen one Nigerian film, and it's not an Hollywood film. It was specifically marketed as an independent Nigerian film because Nollywood is just so all-encompassing now. And it's that film was "This Is My Desire," which obviously made some rounds on festivals a couple of years ago. So I have nothing to add on Nollywood. But going back to China and their blockbuster industry. I know that both of you actually answered this question already, but just to set the stage before we get into the movies, I do actually have to ask, how many other Chinese blockbusters have you seen before this encounters? Because at the very least, there was, that fairly big event back in the mid-2000s when you had films like Hero and House of Flying Daggers, etc. So I'm assuming these aren't the very first Chinese blockbusters you're seeing, Mathieu.
Well, I guess it depends how do we define China. But I actually haven't seen those two Zhang Yimou films, even though I'm quite interested in them. Especially, both of them, Hero and House of Flying Daggers, but I haven't seen them. So I've seen like Crouching Tiger, but that's not really, that's more of a Taiwanese/Western co-production.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and then there's Hong Kong films, which are obviously also a bit different. So no, I actually haven't. I'm very unqualified for this podcast. I'm playing the role of the newbie, I guess.
Well, I think all of us are severely unqualified for this episode, except perhaps Saul. So you mentioned that you at least seen more than Mathieu. How many Chinese blockbusters would you say that you've seen, Saul?
Well, I think I said about maybe 8 to 10 before, but I'm not sure. I guess it depends how you define it. Like Mature, I haven't seen Hero or House of Flying Dagger or Curse of the Golden Flower, any of those films yet. And
Wow.
I know I've been into cinema for longer than he has, so I guess I don't really have an excuse for it, but I guess those films didn't really appeal to me at the time. In terms of what I have seen from China, look, I can't be bothered going through my IMDb stats because they're always awful to look at. But just looking at what I've seen since I've joined Letterboxd, actually, if I try and sort it by when I added it on there, I mean, some of them are going to be co-productions with Taiwan or co-productions with Hong Kong, so they'll actually be genuine China films. But I've seen The Mermaid, which was a Stephen Chow film, which did a really good box office. I've seen Triple Threat, but I think there might have been a co-production with a few other Asian countries. I've seen, the three Detective Chinatown films, Enter the Fat Dragon, Lost in Hong Kong, which is actually a whole series of different films like that. Drug War, which is the first film which Johnny To did in mainland China. Connected, which is a thriller about this person on a phone getting a telephone phone call, and this person's been kidnapped. He has to try and help her out. Hello, Mr. Billionaire, which is a version of Brewster's Millions. It's actually not half bad for what it is. Goodbye, Mr. Loser, which is from the same team and made Hello, Mr. Billionaire, but it's absolutely terrible, so I wouldn't recommend that. So I didn't count that all up, but they'll just give listeners a taste of what I've seen going into the podcast.
Yeah, that's quite a list, Saul. I mean, I've seen a couple of others. I mean, I didn't realize that Cliffwalkers was a blockbuster hit, but it was. It's on the all-time box office list, so at least I have Cliffwalkers down. I have a lot of, well, quote-unquote older ones from the Zeros in, also from Shang. From the more recent ones, I'm not sure if they qualify as Hong Kong or China. I think they're co-productions as well, but things like Ip Man, for instance, I've seen. In terms of the last few years, I think it's really just, like I mentioned, Cliffwalkers and a brand new one called A Writer's Odyssey, which is a kind of fantasy action film, but that's not on the box office list yet. So let's see how that one does, or if it ends up there at all. But yeah, I would say that I'm the second least qualified here, and Saul is then the most qualified, or the third least qualified, so I think that's a lot to work with. And now that we've pretty much established how relatively little we've seen, at least compared to the large hordes of American blockbusters, I think we have the proper framing here. 2 Europeans and 1 Australian jumping in relatively blind. So take this episode for what it is, near instant reactions, and perhaps our choices of the films we are discussing today is quite bad. Perhaps there are much better blockbusters out there, and we would have completely different reactions to a different set of films. So let's see. Feel free to come to the ICM forum and educate us more throughout recommendations, etc. But for the rest of this episode, we just won't dwell too much on that. We'll just get straight into the actual discussion. And what better way than to jump to some of the very first things we think about when we hear the word blockbuster. The massive action film, the huge sci-fi film, or the gigantic world-round disaster film. And with The Wandering Earth, we essentially get these three pillars of blockbuster madness all wrapped up into one. When we talk about disaster films that span the entire world, this one really delivers, as from the very premise, the Earth is literally traveling, spinning from our solar system to another, propelled by gigantic engines to get away from the expanding sun. And this seems to be going okay before an earthquake destroys some of the engines and sets them on a collision course with Jupiter. This just has everything we come to expect from the massive disaster film. Family drama, a massive gallery of characters, often dying characters, heroism, sentimentality, last-minute escapes, and again, as we mentioned in our earlier discussion, just fantastic effect. Oh, and the subplot seemingly ripped off from 2001. So I would love to hear what my co-hosts thought of The Wandering Earth. And for simplicity, we can start with you again, Mathieu.
Yeah, so this is one I actually saw back when it came out, at least here, that is on Netflix. And I saw it because I was familiar with it. There's a novel, right? It's adapted from a novel. I have not read that, but I've read other novels by the same author, and I love them. And so I think I came into this movie with perhaps maybe slightly misjudged expectations, perhaps, because again, I haven't read the novel, but my expectations were not Roland Emmerich, right? I mean, I did know that there would be pretty massive spectacle, but you mentioned a disaster movie. I was not thinking of it in these terms. I was more thinking of it of a big sci-fi film with complex ideas, etc. And I think they're there, but the film, in some ways, it takes a lot of lessons from Hollywood and not just good ones. I think it's very spectacular and it's very it's very effective on a basic level, right? On a very basic emotional level. But I remember being struck particularly by the editing and thinking, oh no, the kind of way too erratic editing that is pretty present in Hollywood is also going to take over China, apparently, which I think is also kind of true for the other films we saw. But yeah, so my impression of The Wandering Earth was a bit mixed. It's definitely a visual spectacle. And on that level, again, I mean, you mentioned the plot. The plot is insane, and it's definitely going to get you images that we've never seen before. But perhaps maybe not as much as you might hope. And yeah, I think the storytelling is at times not served by the way the film is made in some ways.
Like Mature, The Wandering Earth is a film that I saw way back in the day, I guess 2019 when it came out, because it was available on Netflix. It was in the all-time box office list, and I think, if I remember correctly, there was actually quite a big deal made of it at that time. It must have been one of the first real big ones to penetrate the list or get really high up in it. Because, yeah, I remember there being quite a bit of discussion about it on the ICM forum, and I thought, well, look, I like sci-fi films. I don't mind a bit of action. I'll go and I'll watch it. And from what I remember of it, it does have some great images. They've got the shot of Jupiter sucking in the atmosphere of the Earth. As a sci-fi film, though, I guess I found it a bit disappointing. I remember there being quite a bit of melodrama in there, which takes up a lot of the film, and a lot of the action just, I guess, thinking back of it 3 years later, yeah, just felt like mindless action. I mean, I liked some of the ideas, but that's because they're sci-fi ideas and I like sci-fi. I don't know how well they're necessarily worked into it. So, like Mature said, it's a visual spectacle and it's probably enjoyable enough as that. As a blockbuster, yeah, I guess maybe no better, no worse than the average mindless Hollywood blockbuster out there.
Yeah, that's pretty much my take as well, Saul. I think while I was watching it, disaster films crept up more and more as my reference point for me, because it felt like a bit of a mixture of various Roland Emmerich films, for instance, like The Day After Tomorrow and 2012, for instance. In that, you have ice everywhere, you have this essential destruction of the world, and you have these characters racing to save the planet, survive. And that, I think in terms of quality, it's right there. I mean, the character development is quite weak as far as I'm concerned, but that's just the standard in this kind of genre. So I wasn't too bothered by that. I think the suspense was great. I think, that, again, the effects were amazing. Probably my biggest issue with the film was the overt sentimentality, which almost bordered on silly a few times. Like, so often when characters die, you kind of stop the film and you get flashbacks, you get like them saying something heroic before they died, or perhaps the last word is something heroic, and like everything is, the music is played up to make it extra sad, and that just didn't work for me. It just felt really hammed up. But outside of those moments, this film really goes for it. This high-octane action. You have those, insane road rage moments with these big trucks driving through collapsing ice blocks. You have the massive explosions. You just have so much insanity that if what you're looking for is, that action blockbuster thrill of just seeing insane effects and craziness, this will probably not disappoint.
Yeah, but when you mention that the character development is on par with the genre, I guess that's the thing. It's really a disaster movie. It's really that, right?
Yeah.
It's not a smart sci-fi blockbuster, which is kind of what I was hoping it would be. One of the interesting things about it is also the way it portrays kind of international cooperation, right? It's this big thing with Hollywood blockbuster made with Chinese involvement, right? Where you always have China playing a role and helping out, right? Like The Martian being one of the big examples. And I guess this is interesting because it shows kind of the view you have on the Chinese side, which is, yes, let's promote this international cooperation, right? Which I think is it's just interesting to see. It's a pretty conventional idea, but the way it's promoted in this film is slightly different, I feel, than what it would be in a Hollywood blockbuster. And that's kind of what I'm interested in, is to see the subtle differences, because really, for the most part, they are pretty similar, more similar than I thought they would be, those Chinese blockbusters to Hollywood. Like that's what I took from watching this very small sample.
Yeah, that's a great point, Matthew. And I think one of the obvious elements there is that the two astronauts that kind of bond and go on a bit of a mission together is a Chinese astronaut and a Russian astronaut, building on the obvious Chinese-Russian relations. And then you have that the Americans get much less airtime, but they're there. You actually get more French, and I think it's very interesting, especially for a Chinese movie, that essentially the world government is seen as French. It's not that necessarily that weird, because EU language, etc., has often been seen as French, and French has been a political language. But yeah, it was notable that essentially almost any reference to international collaboration, etc., was focused on the French, and the French are the first to answer in many instances as well. So that must have been quite nice for you.
Well, I think we are meant to represent Europe in general, and the fact is, French is an official language of the UN, so it's kind of has this diplomatic role. It's also something that is in his novels, this author, of seeing a Europe at least as being equally important as the US. That's what I mean, right, when I say international, because when the US does international, it's the Russians and maybe the Chinese, whereas in this, it's a little more complete. I mean, Africa doesn't exist, but aside from that, it's a bit more, right, international, which I do think is a bit of a positive, even though it's clearly propaganda-ish, but a little more agreeable, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of propaganda, it has this thing that China is getting, a little bit renowned for, with obviously Chinese characters being extremely heroic and self-sacrificing, etc., which is something we would see in a lot of Russian and Soviet type action films as well. But yeah, I don't think. I mean, it's not really a film that showcases China as, how do you put it, stronger or better, especially if you compare it to the flag-waving kind of disaster film that America often puts out. I thought it was almost a little bit more mellow and a little bit more focused on international collaboration. So yeah, I think it actually, it's right, more or less right there on the threshold, and I agree with you. It's interesting to see how much more focus they give Europe than America usually does. Though this might also be bringing in a bit more politics than we need to for this episode. So I think one of the things that struck me the most is the, how do you put it, the 2001 semi-rip-off, where you have the AI going a bit rogue up in the space station and acting against the astronauts. I mean, the robot or the AI did not get the kind of development or suspense as Al did in 2001, but the characterization is very, very similar, including the climax with it. So it was interesting that they did that, just how similar it was, and the fact that it actually wasn't as suspenseful as that section of 2001 in my mind, because the antagonist was not as developed, it was not as focused on, and that might simply be because you had so many characters and it was trimmed down so much. But yeah, it was definitely an interesting moment, because they obviously had to give the astronauts something to do when they were so removed from all of the suspense down at Earth.
Yeah, I think what I'll add to that, I agree that it doesn't work as well, because 2001 is this very focused, I mean, this part of the 2001 is a very focused thriller, essentially. And this film obviously doesn't have the luxury to do that, right? It has too many things going on. But I'll mention that the author of the book, his big hero is Arthur C. Clarke. So I'm guessing this like straight up 2001 reference is straight from the book. That would be my guess anyway. It's more a literary reference than a filmic reference, if that makes sense. I mean, it works both ways.
I might just add with the whole AI malfunctioning part that, yeah, I did think that was very derivative of 2001 A Space Odyssey. I guess maybe I didn't mind that it didn't compare to it because I actually can't think of any films at all that have tried to copy the whole HAL thing in 2001. Can't think of any films that have done it anywhere near as well. So I guess I didn't really mind it. I was more curious to see that in a Chinese film.
Really, I can't name any, but I feel like I've seen a lot of rogue AI in sci-fi. I'm blanking on naming any, but I feel like it's been done a lot.
It has been done a lot, but it's never been done as well as 2001 A Space Odyssey. So, I mean, like The Simpsons have done it, I believe, in one episode. You've got some similarities with films like Moon, although that takes it in a different direction. So it's been done countless times before, but it's never been done to the same extent as 2001. So for me, it was just another thing in there. It wasn't something where like, oh, I'm so disappointed it's not as good as 2001 because no film has done it as good as 2001.
Yeah, I would never have expected it to be as good as 2001 and handling it either. We can definitely give it a pass there. And to pass the torch on then to our next Chinese blockbuster of the day. This is a far less grim, if we can say it like that, because one thing we didn't cover about The Wandering Earth is that there is, like we said, a lot of death, there's a lot of mayhem, there's a lot of destruction. There's a lot of mayhem and destruction in Detective Chinatown as well, but it's in a far more fun way. And this one really feels like a throwback to what Hollywood was peppering the screens with in the 80s, 90s, and even early zeros with films like Rush Hour, for instance. Buddy comedies in a crime setting, often with cops. And here with a quote-unquote detective. You know, he's a bit shady but scrappy enough to be lovable, and of course the sidekick or partner, the stuttering reserved cousin of an in-law twice removed, or however that endless list of how they were connected actually went, but it was just this long list for comedic effect. And this odd couple needs to resolve a mystery to escape cops, gangsters, actually multiple different gangsters, and a mysterious killer. I mean, this one, once again, has everything we think about when we think buddy comedy, especially in a crime action setting. You have the car chases, the suspense, as I mentioned, the odd couple dynamics. I mean, that just has to be there. And here we also throw in the foreign setting of Thailand. So starting with you again, Mathieu, what did you think about Detective Chinatown?
So I can say I loved it, but it was definitely my favorite of the four. And it's, as you mentioned, it's really much, it really plays like a throwback for us, right? It plays like very much like a 90s Hollywood film, complete with a lot of homophobic jokes, which would definitely be at home in the 90s Hollywood film, but not so much today. And yeah, it's got a lot of really obvious influences. I mean, Jackie Chan is a big one, I think. Right, you see a lot of those early chases with the main character, well, one of the main characters, who is doing a lot of comedic stuff mixed with action, and it's actually pretty good action. I think that's one of the big differences between this and Wandering Earth. This is pretty low on the VFX. It's a lot of practical action, which actually works pretty well. And yeah, it's a big mix of genres also, not as much as like Bollywood does it, but I mean, the basic premise is essentially a Hitchcock wrong man narrative, kind of, where you have a man on the run trying to prove his innocence, except he's also being helped by a kind of Sherlock Holmes superfan. And in terms of the stylistic elements there, I found it very interesting that they basically took the Sherlock from the BBC TV series. I mean, even the music when he's doing his like super precise analysis of looking at very small detail is kind of similar to that show. So it's taking a lot of influences from everywhere and kind of packaging them together, which is what popular entertainment does as well. And speaking of Sherlock Holmes, I also saw a bit of Guy Ritchie in there. That's in terms of the style. That's one element that I think is kind of common to not so much Wandering Earth, but the other three, they're very bold films stylistically, I think, compared to Hollywood films. They do a lot more weird stuff with the camera, right? They're a lot more. They're not afraid to be a little kitschy at times, which I think is generally a positive, right? Because I mean, sometimes it kind of loses you, but in general, they're a lot more adventurous. I think stylistically, which can be a good thing. It has its limits, this film, but I guess I did kind of enjoy it for the most part, and especially I guess the corrupt cop was my favorite character by far. And yeah, the way they treat what I'm talking about with the kind of visual style and the way they kind of go for broke in some things is like this character of the cowboy cop, right? And they go full on Western music when he appears, and they do a lot of slow-mo. I don't know. I think there's something kind of refreshing about that, about the way they will just run with an idea, a visual and stylistic idea, even if it doesn't always fully work.
I'd agree with Mature that Detective Chinatown is the best of the films we're discussing today. I wouldn't say I absolutely loved it. I did have some reservations about it. I mean, it is quite a long film, and there's some really silly things in there, grabbing groins and so on. But in general, it does actually work as a comedy. I do wish it worked a bit better as a mystery. The whole idea of having a Sherlock Holmes character or type of character is really, really interesting, but it's not used that often. I mean, there's a few things where he uses his skills of deduction, but for the most part, the film is a comedy. So the mystery for me, I felt was a bit neglected. The sequels do a bit better with that, which we might come to later on. I might quickly mention the sequels afterwards. But in terms of this first film, yeah, it's enjoyable. Their bonding after initial friction is very easy to predict, but I thought chemistry together. There are some great actually parts in there. It's really interesting to hear what Mature thought were the influences, because the biggest influence for me actually I thought was Buster Keaton in the part where they're creating distraction in the police headquarters or police office, and you've got all these bumbling cops that are tripping over and going on all these traps which they've put in place there. And that sequence for me was probably the funniest sequence of the entire film, and that for me was very Keatonish. But then there's another part which I also thought was really funny, which involved having all these guys hiding in different closets in this woman's upstairs apartment, and her boyfriend charging them, all these people having to pretend they're big surprise relatives for a surprise party. I just thought the whole comedy, the way everybody went along with that, worked really, really well. So for me, Detective Chinatown is a success for me as a comedy, as a mystery less so, and that's probably the disappointment for me. As an action film, not so much. I mean, there are those great sequences in there, but for me, I guess it's mainly a comedy that the film's trying to be, and as mainly a comedy, it primarily works.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I'm a little bit torn on this because a lot of the comedy is, as Mathieu mentioned, really childish, and that's what took a lot of it away from me. I mean, there's a lot of groin jokes, there's a lot of sticking thumbs up people's butts jokes. There's a lot of this just like extreme silliness that brings it down a bit of a notch. But those scenes you described there, Saul, especially the police station, but also the scene where people hiding in closets, like those are, bang on the money, really, really fun. And I think there are a lot of quite hilarious scenes throughout. I mean, we mentioned a lot of these buddy cop comedies, and I think Jackie Chan is definitely one of the biggest influences. And I think he was quite influenced by Buster Keaton. Keaton might have been influenced. There's a lot of this visual comedy. Those are the ones that work the best. I also think the odd couple dynamics here is pretty spot on. And the fact that they didn't make the innocent character, the Sherlock Holmes character, the introverted character. They didn't actually make him that innocent in the end. It has a bit more surprises up its sleeves than you might expect. And as with a lot of these Chinese might feel a little bit closer to a lot of Hong Kong films, even though it's Chinese. But a lot of these films, they do have a bit more moral ambivalence about them. Like the characters here are by no means clean or nice. You have the cop who the semi best friend cop who's secretly helping them a bit, and he's doing that even though he thinks that his friend is a killer for a while there, for instance. But there's just a lot of fun and cool gags here. There's just this insane, massive character gallery. Most of them are not that developed, but they do enough with their facial expressions, hairstyles, etc. to just make them notable for when they're there and deliver. I think the chases, etc. too, they all add up. They deliver. It's fun. It's action packed, and I did actually enjoy the mystery. I agree it kind of took the back seat, and I've more or less forgot about it for the middle section of the film, but towards the end, when they start playing with twists and try to surprise you a little bit, there were some cool ideas coming up there. They weren't as developed as they probably would have been more fun to see. Like, they were still taking the backseat to the comedy, but it was interesting that they went all out with some of these twists and went for in a bit of a darker direction as well.
I think you're right in saying it feels a little more like a Hong Kong film. And I think maybe that's because it's taking place outside of China. And that maybe allows it to be a little more, to be less bothered, I guess, about showing, like, again, a corrupt cop, right? Because it's a corrupt cop in Bangkok, right? It's not a problem with censorship. And it's the same with the sequels, which are also taking place outside China. Though I haven't seen them, but Saul might mention it. And the very broad humor, I guess it's pretty reminiscent of Hong Kong comedies in that way as well. And it's also true of some of the other films we'll talk about. Yeah, a lot of silly faces. And I did like that vaudeville sequence that you guys mentioned with everyone hiding in the closets. It's a classic. It's like the Marx Brothers and even like theater before that. But yeah, it's done pretty well. I mean, yeah, there's a lot to enjoy there. I think it's limited in a bunch of ways. I kind of agree with Saul that the mystery is never that interesting. And the twist at the end is like, yeah, okay, it's a fun twist, but it's not. I mean, it's a lot of the problem when you have that kind of this genius character is that it's basically a Deus ex machina, and that at one point he solves it using things that are kind of not very realistic, and at the same time he misses things. It's the whole issue with mystery storytelling when you have a guy who's a genius in a way that is not really grounded in reality.
It's a very good point that you make, Mature, about the Chinatown film being set in Thailand, and therefore it's easier to have corrupt cops and other individuals doing different things, because I actually have seen both the sequels. In fact, both the sequels, the second one, which is set in America, and the third one, which is set in Japan, are actually the only two Detective Chinatown films on the all-time box office list. So the first film did gross quite a bit, but it didn't gross that much to be an official check on iCheck Movies. And it is kind of funny seeing how many more checks the second and third film have over the first film, because people are just going, oh, I just want to get the official checks. I'm just going to watch the second and third one. Because the series does actually develop a fair bit over the course of the three films. And to just run through them briefly. So the second film, they come to America. And again, for me, it's more of a comedy rather than a mystery or an action film. You've got a really great Trump lookalike character who wants to build a wall on the west coast of America to try and stop immigrants coming in from that way. There's a bazooka-wielding baddie in there, and there are also some intimidating bikies in there who end up coming to the rescue of the two main characters. Some of the comedy in there is really silly. There's a half-naked street chase, which is just, absolutely ridiculous. There's a bit of cross-dressing in there, which I guess for me is probably one of the least funny things a comedy can ever do. There is a really cool Crime Master app in there, which actually appears in the third film also. And I guess it's something which might carry on to a fourth app, which the Sherlock Holmes type character uses. So, I mean, it's all quite interesting, but again, it's a film which works much better as a comedy, as an action or a mystery film. The third film, on the other hand, it actually does have a pretty interesting mystery in it. So it's set in Japan, and they've got an Agatha Christie type of mystery to solve. So it's about this guy, and he gets killed in this room, which is locked or something like that. And there's meant to only be one way they could be killed, but maybe there would have been another way. I mean, the mystery's still never the center part of it. It is mainly a goofy comedy, and there's cross-dressing in there again, which seems to be the big thing with the franchise. Although I don't remember any cross-dressing in the first film, and there's some competitive vomiting and some other silly stuff in there. But there's also some really interesting parts in there. They've got some riddles to solve. It's not quite Die Hard with a Vengeance, but there are some riddle parts in there. And there's an interesting part with Sherlock Holmes guy talking to himself at different points to try and solve the mystery. Like he's talking to different incarnations of himself. But, look, in general, it's probably not better than the first or second film, but it is a bit more interesting because they try and work a bit more of the mystery into it than the first two films do. So, yeah, look, overall, there's worse franchises you could watch than the Detective Chinatown franchise. I mean, none of them are really short films, but all of them, there's a lot of energy in there. Like Mature said, a lot of the camera work, they just go for it. Those shots of the characters walking out there and those big trench coats swinging out behind them. There's a lot of energy put into it, and I guess the energy levels really keep the film up, even when the comedy dips a bit at other times. Oh, and then I just should mention also there's a really funny part, which is almost as funny as a closet mix-up in the first film, which involves some morgue attendants and an elevator. I'm not going to say any more about that. If anybody who's seen the film will know that part. And that's really the funniest part of Detective Chinatown 3.
Well, thanks for that summary there, Sol. I mean, like Matthew, I haven't seen the two sequels yet. I'm definitely semi-interested in seeing them. I might see them in the future. But unlike you, Matthew, Detective Chinatown was actually not my favorite of these four films. In fact, it was probably tied with The Wandering Earth as an okay film, but I actually liked the next two quite a bit. And my favorite of the four films was Pegasus, which I know Saul disagrees with. But just to give the quick intro to Pegasus first, then we can start with the mini battle. This film is really just a love letter to not just sports, or in this case car racing, but just to following your passion. Our lead is a disgraced race car driver, desperate to get back to his almost all-consuming passion. And once his suspension is lifted, the race that may re-establish him on the scene and show that he truly is China's greatest race car driver is the new target. The film hits many of the standard ideas of the older sports hero trying to get back on the horse that we've known and loved from Hollywood over the years, complete with the scrappy heroes, the big race ahead. But at least for me, what is most impressive about Pegasus is how different it felt and how it stayed away from so many of the standard tropes of Hollywood sports dramas or Hollywood sports comedies, and frankly it is far more of a comedy than a drama. I enjoyed that. I don't think Saul did. So let's flip things around a little bit here and let Saul respond first. What did you think about Pegasus, and why didn't it work for you?
I started out actually quite liking Pegasus. I mean, the first few scenes were really funny. They had some really funny moments regarding his racing costume, exaggerated stories, accidental hugging of the wrong person. But as the film went along, for me, I think the comedy pretty much started to dry up. It all became about his determination to succeed, and it wasn't really about humorous mishaps along the way. It was just about him, be determined, I'm going to succeed, I'm going to be the best or whatever. And for me, the disappointment of it is that after this really great comedic start, it becomes a very generic, or at least to me, very generic inspirational sports drama. That said, the final 5 minutes are really bonkers, and that really made me think, oh, maybe I didn't hate this film overall, because it does end in quite a different way, so to speak, and the ending is really good. That's sort of what I was looking for. But a lot of the film for me was really grounded in reality, and I didn't think that was anywhere near where I was successful in. I mean, I'm not a big fan of sports films in the first place, and going down to earth, grounded approach to me was completely wrong in my opinion. And I think if it was able to be a goofy comedy throughout, I guess much like Detective Chinatown was maybe, it would have been something that I would have been able to respond to better.
So I was very confused by this film. I went into it knowing that Chris had liked it, and I think I kind of got why, because if you squint really hard, you might be able to apply the word Brechtian to this film, maybe, and we know Chris loves that. It's a film that's constantly undercutting itself, right? There's a bunch of scenes where you get kind of what would be a standard moment in an inspirational sports movie, and it immediately doesn't work and the characters are ridiculed. But at the same time, it still has the basic plots of an inspirational sports movie. It still is that narrative. In a sense, it made me think less of what an American sports movie would be like than what a French equivalent movie would be. And the reason for that is, as you guys mentioned, it's a lot more grounded, supposedly, or at least it's a lot more interested in the drama of the characters than it is in the actual spectacle of the sports. What you do get it at the end, but you don't get that much of it. And it's not very focused at all on the minutiae, right, of what it is like to be a racing driver or anything like that. It's much more grounded emotionally. And it's, focused on being inspirational and feel good, even though the ending is bold, I will say, if we're taking it in that regard. So it's in many ways unconventional. And I think the reason a French movie of that kind are like that, by the way, is mostly budget, I would say, as much as sensibility, different sensibilities also. I don't know if it's the case for this one. But yeah, I was very puzzled by this film. I don't think the constant back and forth, right, between standard inspirational story and undercutting itself and making fun of what it is really works for me. I think it in the end it kind of lost me as a viewer, but it's definitely a much stranger film than the other we are talking about, which can be a good thing.
Yeah, I think I agree with pretty much all of that. So, like I said at the beginning of the episode, none of these films really stood out as great, but this is the film I like the most. And I think the oddness you mentioned here is definitely one of them. I mean, I don't think we should spoil the ending, but that ending, it's not what you would ever have seen in an American film. And it has two endings as well. So it has possibly slightly more ambiguous or dark ending, and then this all-out crazy ending. And both of them really delivers on something that I don't think we would see in an American film of this kind. The one thing I would disagree slightly with Saul, and perhaps even you, Mathieu, is that I didn't necessarily think it was consistently that grounded. I thought the comedy was more or less there throughout until perhaps the final act of the car race, where things gets a bit more serious. Essentially, you skip the main part of these kinds of sports films where you have the protagonist trying to get back on, the horse. He's training, he's practicing, he's getting better. None of that is essentially there. Instead, you get these ridiculous scenes where he has to get his license back, for instance, and he trashes the car. Or you get scenes where he tries to steal the frame of his old car. You have all of these big comedic scenes, and those pretty much continue for, I would say, 60% plus of the film's running time. It keeps having fun with itself. I agree that some of the undercutting is not always great. The direction is not necessarily fantastic here either, but it is really fun. And like you mentioned, when he goes in with his into the courthouse to essentially plead his case to become unsuspended, and he comes in with his race car suit, and he doesn't realize that the race car suit will beep in the metal detector, and he has to take it all off in front of the cameras, and he'll be there in his underwear. Those kinds of scenes are really bang on the money for this type of comedy, and I think it consistently delivers on the laugh. It consistently delivers on the craziness that picks those scenes of him running towards a friend to hug them, especially the first one where it runs to the wrong person. Those are also, like Saul said, quite hilarious. I think it continues more or less in that vein. But what impressed me a decent amount too was just how, unlike what Saul said, I don't actually think it felt conventional at all, because most, like I mentioned already, that the main tropes of just this race car driver getting ready, practicing, etc., those are completely gone. But this film also has no low interest of any kind. I mean, the romance in the story, if anything, is with his adopted son, and trying to be a father with very limited resources and bring the son along on the adventure. So that's something that's quite different from how American films do it, because they tend to almost always have a love interest. And this is also something we see with quite a few Asian films in general, that parental child issues often gets more focus. But this is a blockbuster and not quite expected. So that was a very nice touch. And then you also have the fact that there is no real antagonist. You have kind of an antagonist in the sense that you have this other great new race car driver who is the new best thing, and our hero wants to beat him. But this guy is actually really nice, and it subverts so many tropes there, because essentially this guy is a billionaire, and I guess it plays into China's take on billionaires and multimillionaires, in that they're kind of great for the country, I suppose. You have this guy who essentially is buying the sport, but he's helping the sport, and he's being such a nice guy. He's always helping, even though the hero doesn't like him very much. He tries to support him in every way he can, because he's just such a big fan and he wants the sport to be better. So that's a really interesting touch. So I think when you have the fact that you don't have the standard build-up, you don't have the antagonist, you don't have the love interest, it really becomes almost all about the passion. The person he's trying to beat is himself. He's trying to be his old self and to really achieve his goals in this sport he loves. And this fact that it all actually takes a degree of competitiveness out of the sport somehow in a sports movie of this kind, that was really interesting to me. So this is one of those Chinese blockbuster films where I could never see Hollywood doing anything remotely similar to that. And I agree with Mathieu, it's a lot more similar to what a French film of this kind would be. And that instantly made it more interesting to me.
I should say, I did not necessarily mean that as a positive or negative thing. It's just different, right? I mean, there are plenty of terrible inspirational French movies of this kind. I would say, I agree, it's unconventional in some ways, but I think the basic idea you described, right? Believe in yourself and realize yourself through your passion. I mean, that's not so unconventional. What's unconventional is the way it focuses on that and undercuts it. And I think that's what it's both interesting and also kind of doesn't always work. And a small point, but I was very confused about what exactly the competition was. I mean, I guess rally driving is not big in China, and so it's kind of unclear if they're competing in a national thing or an international thing. I mean, it's a race in China, but the big champion guy, he seems to be an international champion. Anyway, I was confused by that. It's a very small point, but yeah.
Well, I don't follow race car driving, but I think it's like same as in many sports where you have these kind of events on the tour, and Chinese events often don't get that many international stars, so you probably just have this event where people get invited, you get wild cards, you get set up. So that's more or less like my reference point for this would be tennis. So that's how it works there. That for instance, in the Chinese tournaments, there's usually not that many big Western players that come down, and so that's how I translated it to my mind. But I don't know if that's the case.
Yeah, but my confusion was they mentioned he's like a 5-time champion, but champion of what? I was not.
Oh yeah, I think 5-time champion of this race. That's what I think it was.
Okay.
Oh, and just to add, there's not everything I like about this movie. I mentioned some negatives already. The one thing that made me like the film a lot less than perhaps otherwise would have is, again, the sentimentality that we've seen in some of these other films we've been discussing today as well. Especially, during the race itself, you have, for instance, a crash where someone might have died, and you immediately cut back to a scene where our hero at one point was a teacher training other race car drivers, and this person who crashed is one of the students, and you probably spend like 1 or 2 minutes on this with motivational music, etc., in the middle of the race. Those kind of scenes really didn't work that well for me. I understand that they're trying to make us all emotional and care. This character had essentially no build-up whatsoever. So I think those kind of scenes don't work. And we saw them in The Wandering Earth as well, where they want to, like, when someone potentially dies, you want to, clam up the music, have them say something or interact in some way, get us emotional. That feels really, really forced. And yeah, that just doesn't work, at least for me.
Yeah, before we move on to the last film, I just want to add that there is one scene that you guys haven't mentioned, which I think is the best scene in terms of the kind of almost absurdist comedy. And that's the scene where they go to a mob boss and to get financing or something, and they have to dance, to sing and dance to get him to agree. And I do think that's the one moment where the tone of the film really worked for me. But yeah, otherwise the tonal weirdness of the film kind of put me off.
I think that's the main difference between us here, that the weirdness worked for me, it didn't work for you. So if you want a slightly weirder sports movie / blockbuster from China, this might actually be the film for you. And that actually takes us to the very last film we will be discussing today, Nesha, if I am pronouncing that correctly, which is based on a legend that apparently just keeps being readapted and readapted, essentially rebooted even more than Spider-Man. But just to be clear, for this episode we are talking specifically about the 2019 animated film, which, as I mentioned in our intro, is actually China's highest grossing animated film of all time, and is placed just outside the top 100 of the all-time international box office. I mean, that's just incredible. And as you might expect from this kind of Chinese legend, it's a tale of a force, akin to a yin and a yang, that became so destructive that the good and the evil was split, with the evil instantly cursed and set to be destroyed. A little later, the good force is meant to be joined with the newborn child of a royal family, but with some sneaky shenanigans by the film's villains, it is changed with the evil force, leaving the family and the godly masters to deal with a child set for nothing but destruction and death. With the question being, can this child change what he is? The film has so much from big and possibly even confusing mythology, at least for us Western viewers, but a lot of focus is actually placed on destiny and your ability to change destiny. And it's just loads of fun, loads of action set pieces, lots of fighting. Oh, and with the sneaky twist we mentioned earlier, there's also an additional child born from dragons, but with the good force. Meaning you have essentially a human child with the evil force in them, and this child born from dragons, which have been banished essentially to hell, with the light force. Then you have something darker with the good force inside of it for just more moral ambivalence, and with these two forces set to clash, leading to a lot of mayhem, a lot of entertainment, and again just stellar animation. So I would absolutely love to hear your takes on Nesha.
Like what Chris said with Neja, the mythology for me was definitely quite confusing, although I did find it a little bit dull also. So I didn't really care to work out what was going on. I mean, I'm not really big into things like spirits. So when the characters start rambling on about it, my brain just shuts off. Where the film worked for me was as a tale of a child trying to fit in. So there's some great scenes of him trying to play with others. Whether he realizes it or not, it sort of seems like he thinks it's a big, elaborate game of hide and seek. There's some really silly effects. So there's a part where he manages to get the person training to him to kiss a toad, and that, leads to this over-the-top allergic reaction, which, no, the animation effects weren't great or whatever, but it just looks so silly. And there's all of silliness involving this giant overweight pig that keeps popping up. So look, it didn't really do much for me as a comedy or as a story. I didn't think it really went in any unexpected directions. He has to win the trust of the villagers by becoming their savior. I did sort of like the idea that it tried to put together some wuxia martial arts style training and then mixing that with the animation. So it's not just one of those kung fu type films like Shaw Brothers films from the 70s or 80s where you're learning to train or whatever and do all these amazing moves. I mean, there is that, but rather than having all this wire fu work in there, rather than people hanging off wires doing stunts, they're able to animate the stunts instead, which is a little bit different. And look, some of the animation does look great, stunts aside. I mean, there's some really cool glowing lava effects and fire effects in the mix. So, I guess overall, I didn't dislike the film. I thought it was okay. But I guess if there was more focus on him as a boy trying to fit in and not being able to fit in, if there was less focus on the mythology, maybe it would have done slightly more for me.
Yeah, this one was a big disappointment for me. I mean, it's not bad. The animation is quite good, especially the background stuff. The characters are okay, and the rest is quite good. But I'm generally a much bigger fan of animated fantasy than you guys are, so I was expecting to like this one a bit more. And yeah, it's very standard. It's if you're looking for a Hollywood comparison, it's much more of a DreamWorks type of thing than I don't know, Pixar or something a little better. By the way, I don't think it's wuxia. I think it's like the gods and demons subgenre, which I think is a little different. I don't claim to be an expert, but I don't think this quite qualifies as wuxia, however that's pronounced. Yeah, I guess I don't have that much to say about this film. I think maybe the more interesting part was that the whole message was to fight against determinism, right? That's like the big thing, which is a very standard message you would get in a Western movie, but I guess it's maybe slightly more subversive in China because that's not the traditional culture, but I don't know. Other than that, it's the humor is very broad, like in Detective Chinatown, but I guess it kind of undercuts the whole high fantasy of it, which is kind of what I tend to like. And yeah, like Chris mentioned, it's a big classic of Chinese literature, and apparently there was a film in the 70s which was a really important film for Chinese animation. So I think I kind of feel for the Chinese public, which gets this kind of, to me, it seems watered down version of it. I don't know. I did not really find much of interest in this film, I guess, aside from the quality of the animation.
I think I was the one who liked this film the most. I didn't love it, and I don't think it's that big a step above something like, say, Detective Chinatown. I think that a lot of the comedy is very similar in that it's broad, it's a lot of, just childish tricks, but it still works. And I think, when you have this, child who's, like you all mentioned, is playing this large hide and seek with the population that's terrified of him because he has superpowers and he causes mayhem everywhere around, those were quite funny. Again, not necessarily hilarious, and it's definitely not the Pixar level. I mean, even, the lesser Pixar level we're getting used to today, it's certainly more, say, average DreamWorks level. So not DreamWorks best, but DreamWorks is more average, maybe even mediocre productions. But the animation is great. It really creates the world. There's lots of, these fun side characters popping up. I didn't mind the pig at all. I mean, it's obviously, it's a film for the whole family. There's a lot of, slightly more childish comedy in there, but that's what you expect more or less from that kind of film. If anything, one of the biggest issues for me was the same issue that I think both of you had, which is that the mythology is a little bit confusing. But that's obviously just because we're not immersed in this. I mean, I looked up, the bad guy and the good guy on Wikipedia, and I mean, one of them is actually very well established in Chinese religion. It's interesting to see that, and probably they would know these characters instantly. I guess it would be a little bit for like me if they did a story about Thor, not Marvel Thor, but actually like the actual mythological god Thor, and maybe Chinese viewers would be very confused by that. I do think that the way they are presenting it, there's a lot of details. When these godly characters show up in the beginning, you get their names pop up. And I guess for Chinese viewers, they would know who these characters are right away. Obviously, we don't. So there's definitely a slight cultural barrier here. But like Saul mentioned, that like the basic plot, overcoming destiny, and the basic fun, all of that is solid, it's there, it works, and it's done with great animation. So for what it is, I don't have much to complain about. I liked it, but I didn't love it.
Just regarding the mythology, I was not confused by it that much. Not that I know it, but it's actually exactly what I love about this kind of thing. If anything, I wanted more of it, right? Yeah, that's kind of the direction I wish the film had gone more into, rather than the high fantasy stuff, rather than kind of more standard, well, not necessarily more standard, but a different kind of standard, I suppose, more comedic focused adventure tale.
Which is, of course, very interesting because I absolutely hate the mythology, and I'm generally somebody who dislikes mythology in films. I mean, we can probably get into that in a separate podcast, but yeah, it's probably the least interesting thing for me is when a film starts to go off and starts to explain different things about spirits and other things that exist. I did think it was quite interesting that Chris mentioned that he didn't mind the pig because, come on, it's a family film, so I can just imagine, that this is like Chris's type of film or whatever. You just have this gigantic, overweight pig, and you're going to make Chris's day. I'm sorry, Chris. I couldn't help but mention that.
Well, that's all right. I mean, if you have a giant, enormous pig for a comedic effect, it might make my day. I don't know. I mean, it didn't quite make my day here, but I did have a couple of laughs courtesy of it, or at least a couple of smiles. But the big pig did not bother me.
We need to get to the bottom of this pig hatred that Sola has, clearly. I did not think the pig was a huge part of the movie, to be honest.
Oh, exactly. Maybe there's some childhood trauma involving very large and obese pigs.
Oh, it's just the way the pig is animated. I mean, it's not just like fat or whatever, it's like morbidly obese. I mean, we can't show a picture during the podcast or whatever, but if anybody's seen the film, it's not your average pig, and just the way its weight is overplayed for comedic effect. I mean, it just seemed to be sending quite a negative message, I guess, for obese people out there. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's just the way I was reading it, but I'm just like, this is not funny or whatever to have this like sickly, morbidly obese pig in there.
Okay, that's actually a fair point. I mean, it is, there is quite a bit of fat shaming, I guess, in this film. Not so, I mean, the pig, I guess, but more so his, the master who has it, right, who's kind of mocked for being a drunk and being fat.
Yeah, I mean, here you have essentially a master and animal, or, I mean, the pig is essentially his horse. It's what he rides on, and you essentially have a large, fat god riding on a large, fat pig, and the master also looks a bit like a pig. So you definitely have that duality comedy going on there, and like you've seen with Detective Chinatown as well, the comedy in a lot of these Chinese blockbusters is quite broad. I mean, that's the norm with Hollywood as well. But I do think that Mathieu might be quite right in that the comedy is broad in a way that we more associate with, say, the 2000s and 90s than with comedies right now. I guess Hollywood might have changed slightly in the type of comedy they use, while that type of comedy is still very popular in China. That would be my main takeaway from this. Not to say that China is necessarily behind or anything, but that the trends and what type of comedy they use is definitely a little bit different.
Well, I think in terms of animated films, that's still something you see a lot in Western films, right? Generally, films that are more family-oriented, I think, are still just as broad as this is. I'd say it's more of a contrast with Detective Chinatown, right? This kind of movie is not as broad now in Western cinema. But maybe the fact that we're discussing the duality of pig and man is a sign that we should end this episode. I don't know.
So I guess this is a slightly shorter discussion than we might have on this specific film. But I think that kind of comments on what type of film it is as well. I mean, it is the standard big action animated film. It has all of the classic elements you'd expect. You can probably compare it to, say, films like How to Train Your Dragon, but in terms of quality, it would probably be closer to, say, the third film than the first. So I would say, like, all of us here agree that animation style here is great. It's, like, the budget clearly paid off. Chinese animators know exactly what they're doing. I haven't seen a lot of Chinese animated films. I think the only one I can think of off the top of my head is The Monkey King from the 60s, which is, by the way, a great film. Definitely recommend that. Similar in terms of the fact that it delves quite into mythology, but I'm certainly very interested in seeing more big Chinese animated films.
Just to confirm, I've seen the 60s Monkey King film also, and that one actually is, really cool. It's a bit of a crazy film in there, some a bit strange and weird and unusual sequences as he's causing havoc in heaven, as the English title of the film goes. So, I'd recommend that. In fact, I'd recommend that much stronger than Ne Zha.
Yeah, definitely. I would certainly recommend The Monkey King more than Esha, and all of the films we discussed in this episode. Actually, it's just a really, really great film. But now that we've actually, covered these four films in a decent amount of details, and we've seen at least four big Chinese blockbusters, I would be interested to know if these have changed your opinions on what Chinese blockbusters might be and what they have to offer.
I wouldn't say my opinion has changed much, even though they were kind of disappointing in some ways. I'm interested in Chinese blockbusters as much, well, if not more, than I am in Hollywood blockbusters, but just because they're a bit exotic, I suppose. It's a shame that they don't make their way into theaters here. I would love to see some of the big spectacle ones in theaters. That would be great. But in the meantime, we'll have to do with Netflix, I suppose. But yeah, I'm definitely interested in seeing more of them.
I don't know if my opinions really changed much after seeing these four films because, as mentioned at the start, I've seen, a few Chinese blockbusters beforehand. They're not all of them that good. I guess I will continue to seek out Chinese comedy blockbusters because I'm a big comedy fan. I still do want to eventually do the Is Comedy Universal podcast because I'm a fairly easy person to get to laugh. So, I generally like, foreign comedies from places such as, Russia and India and whatever, which, some of my co-hosts absolutely scorn. So I'm interested in seeing more Chinese comedies. Not all of them are going to be great. So I mentioned the one, Goodbye, Mr. Loser, was pretty bad. But yeah, most of them are decent enough entertainment. In terms of whether I'm going to seek out more Chinese blockbuster dramas, like Pegasus or Neja's comedy and drama, probably not. But I will be interested in checking out any more comedies from China that end up succeeding well in the all-time box office list.
I actually have the opposite reaction to Soldier in that I'm quite likely to check out more Chinese animation films. I'll probably check out more of the Chinese action films as well, but I'm probably less likely to check out the Chinese comedy films. I mean, I'll probably see some of them. I'm definitely interested, but I think Detective Chinatown did not wow me the same way it wowed my co-host in this episode. So, and like they traditionally have not been as big a fan of Chinese or Hong Kong comedies. In terms of whether my perception changed, a little bit definitely, but in different ways. So I would say that the big Chinese blockbusters of the zeros, like Hero and House of Flying Daggers, I still think those are better than the ones we discussed today. I guess in some ways I was hoping to see more films like this, but I also really enjoyed our Writer's Odyssey, which we did not discuss in this episode. So these big action blockbusters from China is definitely something I'll keep looking out for and watching. I will say that of the blockbusters for the last couple of years at least, Cliffwalkers was actually the one I liked the most, which is not an action film, it's more of a war film. Obviously a lot of smooth gun action, etc., and some spy action. It still has a lot to deliver there, but not quite the type of film that we've been discussing today. But no, I would say that just from this episode, and now the fact that I know that these films are so frequently coming to Netflix and other streaming platforms, I will certainly be seeking out far more Chinese blockbusters than I have before. So that's definitely my big takeaway from this, just realizing how available these blockbusters are. The fact that they really deliver on the special effects and the animation, just knowing that they are up there with the quality standards of Hollywood, and just learning so much more of what to expect from Chinese blockbusters today. That's been, frankly, reasonably eye-opening. I'm very excited to have been just watching these four films and a few others relatively closer together now. I will watch more, and I'm very happy we did this episode, because I wouldn't have watched these films otherwise or been aware of just how readily available these films were. And of course, Talking Images is always readily available on Sounder, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and wherever you get your podcast fix. And we are also readily available on icmforum.com, where we add threads for every episode we put out, and you can come in there and discuss anything at all with us. Like, did you enjoy this episode? Do you think we were completely off the mark? Should I pick very different blockbusters? Are we just completely ignorant on what Chinese blockbusters have to offer? I mean, come to ICM Forum, let us know. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and join us again soon. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.